Thanks everybody for joining in our webinar this evening. We are going to talk about muscle physiology. The products that we have on sale at the moment, the Racing Formula, Race Booster Pace, Electroaid, and Formula E and SE. We'll touch on a couple of those at the end, but really feel free to ask any questions that you want at the end about those products. We'll highlight primarily the Electroaid as we go through and look at muscles and how they function. So I think it's really important to start off with what is a muscle and why are we talking about muscles? Because muscles make up the framework of your performance horse or even just a broodmare or a maintenance horse. One of the things that we first notice is we notice muscle wasting if they're losing their top line in an older horse, in a young horse, in a performance horse. So let's talk about what is muscle. It's made up of 70% water, 20% protein, and about 10% fats and other energies and other minerals. And here you've just got a fairly crude diagram, which we'll get into a little bit more detail as we go through the slides, of this outer connective sheath that's holding everything together. And you can see we've kind of got bundles of muscle cells within and that connective tissue going all the way through. And then if we pull out one of those bundles, we have individual muscle cells, and then within those individual muscle cells, it gets smaller and smaller. But in these next slides, we will get into a little bit more detail on the actual muscle. But first of all, I think it's important that we realize that not all muscle is the same. There are actually three basic muscle types. Smooth muscle, which is this diagram down the bottom, and you can see long, thin lines. It looks very smooth. This, sometimes called visceral muscle, we're going to find this in the digestive system, in the uterus of females, capable of prolonged activity without fatigue. You know, we need that gastrointestinal tract to continually be moving and not get fatigued. But it's small peristaltic contractions, just small little muscular contractions. There's no way to really make it stronger. But if we have some kind of blockage in the esophagus or in the gut, these muscles are just not strong enough to push it through. They're involuntary muscles. So I don't have signals that go from my brain and my stomach on my command that say, you know, start moving the food along. This is involuntary. If we then go to the cardiac muscle you're going to see here in the middle, it's found only in the heart. So this is what your microscopic view of your heart. And this actually requires no nerve stimulus. So your smooth muscle and your skeletal muscle requires nerve stimulus to get it going. In the skeletal muscle, those nerve stimuli come from conscious thought and conscious effort to make it happen. The smooth muscle, it's not coming from any consciousness. And then the cardiac muscle just works on its own. Contractions are very rhythmical and require no conscious control, just like the smooth muscle. I don't have to think to make my heart pump. It just pumps on its own. A lot more structure in here. If you've ever in anatomy or in cutting up organs ever cut up a heart, you notice that tissue is a lot more dense and a lot more compact than other muscles in the body. You see this smooth muscle, if you cut through intestine, it's thin and slimy versus muscle that you would eat, depending on the different area of the animal. Looks completely different to that cardiac muscle as well. So then if we go to skeletal muscle, I'm sorry, my diagram's kind of backwards, but either striated or skeletal muscle, I typically call it skeletal muscle or skeletal muscle if I'm going back to Australia, usually attaches itself to bones in the skeletal system, either directly via tendons, and these act voluntarily, like I am controlling these. Bones serve as levers and the muscles move the body voluntarily under direct control. So I have to consciously think of picking up my arm To make my muscles work, my bones act as levers. If my arms are just laying on the desk and I don't pick them up, they're not going to work. But I've eaten dinner tonight and my intestines are constantly working, as is my heart. They're non-voluntary, while your skeletal muscle is voluntary. Skeletal muscles are also usually arranged in opposite sets, so that one set of muscle fibers bends the limb, the flexors, and the other ones straighten it. So your skeletal muscles move in lots of different directions versus your smooth muscles in your intestine. It's just constantly going in one direction, and your heart is constantly doing the same thing. It's very repetitive, versus skeletal muscles can do lots of different movements. These voluntary muscles become fatigued and need to rest after short periods of time, and we really need to feed those. So when we think about nutrition, we're really thinking about feeding these skeletal muscles. So what is the function of muscles? Well, produce movement. When we think more about our skeletal muscles, we're thinking about maintaining posture. We're also stabilizing joints. They also actually can generate heat. We're not going to talk about thermoregulation or thermodynamics today, but that's a byproduct of those muscles moving, and that friction is some of them create heat. So here, now let's get down to the more intricacies of those muscles. So we have our bone here and our tendon, which is holding that muscle to the bone so that when those bones can act as levers. We have the fascia, which is all the way around those muscle bundles, and around here we've got this connective tissue. You can see we've got different layers of that connective tissue surrounding epiphyseal. I'm not even going to try and say it properly. I always get these words confused, but we've just got different layers that are surrounding these muscle bundles, and then that individual muscle fiber still coming out of that one bundle there. Now, if we take it down so we go back, and we are now looking at this individual muscle fiber or muscle cell, and within that we have thicker and thinner little structures, for lack of a better word, which we'll talk about more on the next slide. But we've got more of that. We've got these nuclei that are right under the surface, because I said these muscles, these skeletal muscles, these are controlled consciously by nerves and nerve endings. So we need to put those in those muscle bundles so that they know to move. That sarcoplasmic reticulum, it stores calcium ions, and later on you'll see, you're thinking, there's minerals in the muscle. Later on, you'll see how these minerals actively work going in and out to contract and relax those muscles. So we see here in one of our microscopic structures is MYOFIBRIL. And you can see that you have myofilaments and myofibril. Sorry, that is covered over there, and we have within that we have this actin and myosin. You may have heard of actin and myosin before, and the actin is a thin filament and the thick filament is the myosin. I know this is getting very complex and really not on a day-to-day basis what you're going to be talking to your clients about. But every now and again, I think it's really good. You know, we spend a lot of time thinking about how to make muscles grow, how to get a better top line, how do I do this, how do I do that. So I really wanted to get more into the nitty-gritty, right down into the actual chemistry and the science of these muscles and all of the fibers, to show you that it's just so complex, and all of these are really made up of little proteins. Now we can take those thick and thin filaments and break those down even further, and you can see these blue kind of spun lines, that's those thin actin filaments, and the thick ones here are these myosin filaments. And if you've really read a lot about muscle physiology, you definitely hear a lot about actin and myosin. And those actin especially, you can see we're composed primarily of proteins. So we always talk about protein and how we need protein to build muscle, but there are also triggers that help to lay down protein and help to build these structures, and that trigger is exercise. That's why I always say that you cannot just feed protein and expect your muscles to develop. I mean, there's a certain amount of development that's going to occur because my involuntary muscles are moving, so they're exercising, so they're going to be laying down protein and building. But unless I'm actively moving my muscles, I'm not actually developing muscle fibers. This is a little more close-up look at those thin bands and those thicker bands, and they're all interwoven. You can see now how we take it down. I think the next slide is better than this. It's a little bit more broken down, how we've got our muscle fiber grouping together about 10 to 100 muscle fibers here and down into the muscle cell, and then within the muscle cell we've got myofibrils and myofilaments. Actin and myosin being those contractile proteins that we need to be feeding, and we need to be feeding good quality sources of protein. So, the properties of muscle fibers which produce movement. We're going to have irritability. It's the ability to receive and respond that stimulus. So when I consciously make the effort to lift up my arm, there are signals going that have to stimulate those muscles to either I may want to contract my bicep, so I'm going to shorten my muscle when that stimulus is received, or I want to extend my arm and I want to lengthen. And so that is going to stimulate your muscles to relax. So I mentioned earlier that there were nervous system, there are neurons that send signals that stimulate these muscles to move. And so you can see here we've got our spinal cord, we've got our nerves going out, and this is a very, very simplistic view, but we've got millions of different nerve endings going all over the body, but they're going in to those individual muscle fibers and attaching so that we can have, you can individually signal or stimulate individual muscle fibers, and that's why we have such complex movement. I thought this was really interesting because I think it breaks down. What you can notice here, we've got chloride, sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. So this is the muscle in a relaxed state. So a muscle fiber. And you can see chloride is moving back and forth. Sodium is on the outside of the muscle cell, muscle fiber, and potassium is on the inside. Calcium sitting here, magnesium kind of going back and forth along these muscle fibers. But then when we actually want to make that muscle do exercise, when we want to contract that muscle, chloride's still moving back and forth, but look at this now. Sodium is being pushed into the muscle cell, potassium is being pushed out of the muscle cell, and magnesium and calcium are also coming in and out of that muscle cell, muscle fiber, being pushed in and out. So what do you think these are? What are chloride, sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium? Someone write it in the chat box. What are these minerals? Somebody write something. I know you all know it. Exactly, Cindy. These are electrolytes. Electrolytes are responsible for muscle contraction. So if you don't have these minerals, then you're going to have really poor performance. You're going to have fatigue. So hence why, especially now when your horse is sweating a lot and he's losing a lot of these electrolytes, it's really important to be replacing them, because what's the first thing that's going to go down? Muscle stability, muscle performance, because we can't contract and relax our muscles as willingly as we wanted to because we've got so much fatigue. When you have a horse with HYPP, this sodium-potassium channel here, this is irregular. And what we find is instead of sodium being on the outside, potassium being on the inside, and then I always like to use the gate opening, and now we have them going back and forth. What happens with that horse with HYPP is that gate is always kind of open. So they're always just kind of leaking back and forth. That's why you get those constant muscle fasciculations, because the horse is not really controlling that relax and contract. He's always just sitting in the middle, and his muscles are just always kind of shivering because they're not really contracting, but they're not really relaxing. They're just shivering. So, excellent. Now you can see as we go down into the muscle, and you see what's making it contract, what's making it release. Once we get that nerve stimuli, something now has to be able to push in and out to make that muscle actually contract. The nerve stimuli come and say, you need to move, and it's these electrolytes, these minerals that go in and out as a response to those nerve stimuli to make your muscles contract and relax. This is a very simplistic view, as you noted from these earlier images, just how complicated those muscle cells and muscle fibers are, but you get the gist of it. So, muscle contraction, it's a force. It depends on the number of fibers stimulated. I said individual fibers can be stimulated individually within that muscle, skeletal muscle. Not all the fibers are stimulated at the same time. You know, if I just got let's just say I'm picking up a pillow, and I don't have to use a lot of strength. What if I'm picking up a saddle? I'm using a little bit more strength. Now I'm picking up 2 5-gallon buckets full of water. I'm using a lot more muscle fibers. I'm using a lot more strength. So different combinations of muscle fibers being fired, being stimulated, make different contractions and differing responses depending on the amount of strength that I need. And the more muscle fibers that I have and the more that I'm developing, because I'm constantly exercising and constantly building those up, the more fibers are contracting, the greater the muscle tension, so the more power that I have. And they can continue to do that contraction, relaxing contraction cycle until they run out of energy. Now, what is the primary energy for muscles? It's glucose. We can utilize fats for longer, slower energy, but for sheer power, really quick, fast twitch muscle fibers, we're going to be using glucose. That's why with race horses or barrel racing horses or anything that needs to go fast, you need to be adding those fuels that are going to feed that fast twitch muscle fiber. The other thing to note there is in humans, you can feed yourself. If I'm going to run a marathon tomorrow, I can eat a lot of pasta today and I can load my muscles up. I can carbo load, but you can't do that with horses because their muscle fibers get different muscle fibers and develop different muscle fibers depending on the source of fuel that you're feeding them. So if you feed them a lot of fat, you're going to develop more of those slow twitch muscle fibers, those long, slow muscles, versus if you feed them a lot of carbohydrate, they're going to develop more of those fast twitch muscle fibers. So if we have our horses on a high fat, high fiber diet most of the time, and then on Friday before you go run barrels on Saturday, you think, well, she was a little slow last week, so I'm going to add some oats tonight. All you're going to do is give her a gut upset. She's not going to run faster because her muscles aren't used to that energy source. So whatever you want to compete on, you need to feed them during your prep. So how is muscle formed? Exercise upregulates signals or triggers that provide a message to create proteins from amino acids. So what is an amino acid? It's something like lysine, methionine, threonine. Those amino acids from signals from exercise form strands of protein. Amino acids are just little beads. If you think about beads on a necklace, the amino acids are just the little beads, and exercise triggers the bonding of all those beads to make one long protein. And depending on the triggers, depending on that makes the different types of protein. So muscle growth occurs whenever the rate of muscle protein synthesis is greater than breakdown. So as we're exercising, we're breaking down muscle, but we want to be able to be feeding those muscles, feeding the animal the right type of proteins so that muscle synthesis outdoes muscle breakdown. If we have a lot of older horses that are losing their top line, their muscle breakdown, protein breakdown is faster than they're developing it. Why? A lot of older horses don't do a lot of exercise because they're old. So their rate of protein breakdown outweighs their rate of protein synthesis. Resistance training leads to injury of those cellular proteins in the muscle, which activates these other satellite cells to begin a cascade of events leading to muscle repair and growth. Now, we didn't really talk about satellite cells, but know that they're in there. All horses do at least minimal exercise. They walk around the stall or they walk around the paddock. That will trigger minimal amount of amino acids to build protein and proteins to build muscle. So we say amino acids are the building blocks of proteins and proteins are the building blocks of muscle. Amino acids turn into protein and proteins turn into muscle. But this is just the bare minimum. If you want your horse to have that really nice show top line, then you need to do more exercise. And I was just discussing with a lady the other day, it also depends on the type of exercise that your horse is doing. Which we will chat about. So the results of increased muscle use. Now, we're exercising our horse more. We're going to increase the muscle size. The mass of the muscle fibers increases, not the actual number of muscle fibers. So I'm not going to get exponentially more muscle fibers, but the actual size and strength of those muscle fibers does increases strength and efficiency, and you over time become more fatigue resistant. These muscle fibers become very efficient at utilizing the energy to continue to work. I really should have talked about vitamin E first, but selenium is an antioxidant. We've been talking about exercise, and in all of this process of exercise and rate of turnover and protein synthesis, something else that's occurring, because we've talked about fatigue and if muscles are fatiguing. Well, there's substrates, either those fats or that glucose that is feeding, that's an energy substrate that's feeding those muscles to give them energy so that they continue to do all this. Well, when those muscles are breaking down that energy and utilizing it to continue working, there are byproducts, and they're reactive oxygen species, and an antioxidant comes in and removes those as an antioxidant. So we want these oxidative byproducts out of there, and those antioxidants, i.e. selenium and vitamin E, come in and remove those. So selenium and vitamin E, this is how they're really important with muscle function. Obviously, they have a bunch of other things as well. Vitamin E works in conjunction with that selenium to really help get rid of those oxidative, reactive oxidative species and decrease muscle damage. So I think it's important that we talk about top line, because when we talk about muscle, this is probably the most question that common question that I get. I want to put muscle, I want a bigger top line. What is a top line? A good top line is not fat. A good top line is muscles over the back of the horse. All right? So, what factors affect the top line? The factors that affect the top line are the factors that affect muscle. So, age, because older horses, they're not working as much and their protein synthesis decreases. Pregnancy or lactation, because we're putting a lot of stress on those top muscles, and horses are very good at utilizing nutrients in their body in the primary area that they're required. So when we're developing a fetus, that takes precedence, and they're going to suck calcium out of their bones. They're going to take protein out of their own muscles to feed that baby. Lack of or incorrect exercise, poor saddle fit. If you get down on your hands and knees and pretend to be a horse and you get somebody to poke you in the back with a pencil where the saddle would go, what are you going to do? You are going to drop your back immediately and your head will arch up into the air. That's what happens if you have poor saddle fit. And then also diet. So oftentimes in my line of work, we get a lot of people, oh, the diet, we got to feed more protein, we've got to do this or that. And they forget about all these other things that are just equally as important. So can you feed a perfect top line? Well, yes and no. It really requires the combination of nutrition and exercise, essential amino acids like that lysine, but also correct exercise. We want that horse's back to round, to utilize these muscles and not be U-shaped like that. I just talked recently with a lady who's got a horse off the track, and she's struggling to get some weight on him. And when I looked at the photographs compared to the photographs of when he was at the track he was doing an enormous amount of exercise and his muscles were really strong and developed. So we're kind of on a double-edged sword here. Because he's thin, you don't want to just do a lot of exercise and cause him to lose more weight. But a lot of that thinness was over his top line where we wanted to develop muscle. So we put together a plan where she was actually going to do some very conscious exercise. She wasn't just going to go trail ride this horse for a couple of hours and waste calories, but she was going to do some really conscious back building exercises, doing some hill work, doing some poles, doing some cavalettis, so that the exercise that he was doing was really there to build muscle and not just burn calories, because this horse did not need to burn calories. When I talk about protein, really lysine is the most important protein. And why? Because it is the first limiting amino acid. And what does that mean? Well, if you look here and we use the barrel, the whiskey barrel analogy, and if every single slat in that barrel represents a different amino acid, we've got lysine and methionine and leucine, isoleucine, valine, tryptophan, phenylalanine, and threonine, and we look at the amount where that lysine one is cut off. Where's the water? It can only go up to the level of lysine. If we increase the amount of lysine in the diet, we can increase the amount of water in the barrel. We can increase the utilization of all of these other amino acids. So methionine is typically considered the second limiting amino acid, and lysine is the first limiting amino acid. So we need to make sure that we're feeding plenty of lysine. 24 grams a day is actually the amount of lysine required for a 1,000-pound horse. So when we think about adding protein to the diet and where's lysine going to come from, well, it's going to come from things like your alfalfa, legumes, soybean meal. These are all containing our amino acids. So real quick, we'll talk the electrolytes, the electroaid paste, and the electrolyte powder that we have. We absolutely need to make sure we're feeding those to horses, because otherwise what will happen? Muscle function will be damaged. We'll get stiffness, soreness, we just will fatigue. Those muscles just won't be able to contract and release. And now you can see how electrolytes are actually working on a muscular level. Now they work in lots of other parts of the body too, but that's how they're working on a muscular level. They're also working in your smooth muscle. And your smooth muscle, you certainly don't want your digestive system to stop working. Otherwise, you're going to get colic. So the paste and the powder, and one of the unique things about the DAC electrolyte is that it's very low in sugars. So if you have a lot of sugar in an electrolyte, really it increases the palatability, but that sugar will decrease the absorption of those electrolyte salts. So really, you put a lot of sugar in something like Gatorade, so kids will continue to drink it and parents will continue to buy it, but it's really blocking the uptake of a lot of those electrolytes. I don't like to put the electrolyte directly in the water bucket because I want to make sure that he's drinking plenty of water, and if he's not drinking, that whole 5 gallons, I want him to get those electrolytes a little quicker than it might take him to drink a whole 5-gallon bucket of water. The racing formula, we talked last month about the Total Performance and the Total Performance Plus, and the racing formula is another performance vitamin and mineral supplement, and our electrolytes and our other minerals are in those vitamin and mineral supplements as well as our vitamin E. The racing formula has slightly more vitamin K. Now, vitamin K is produced by the bacteria in the hindgut, but if we have horses that are doing a lot of exercise, that are stabled a lot, and their hindgut may be failing a little bit, then definitely having that additional vitamin K can be beneficial. There is vitamin K in the Total Performance and Total Performance Plus, but there's a little bit more in the racing formula. When it comes to the race booster paste, I will say that there is some anecdotal evidence that feeding adrenal cortex, which is part of a cow brain, well, it's part of lots of different, all animals have an adrenal cortex, but the adrenal cortex supplement comes from cow brain, and it is supposed to give a little more energy. I think that it works on some and not others, and it's one of those that you give it a try, and if you think you notice something in your horse, you continue to feed it, but it's not going to work in all. More limited research on feeding adrenal cortex, but it's just another option for your clients. So with that, I will take any questions. I know it was a little overwhelming, but please ask questions on anything. Best exercise for top line. Every discipline is going to have different names of exercise, I guess, but I would say anything that's long and low, also hill work. If you think about doing hill work, that horse is moving up, they're really using their hind quarter, they're having to push themselves up that hill, and you know yourself, if you're trying to climb a hill, you do not have your head up in the air. You are down, and you've got your head down and you're pushing with your legs. I've talked with a couple of Amish clients about getting some top line on their buggy horses and recommending that just for training at home, taking that kind of top, I don't even know what they call it, but the part of the harness that really keeps their head up in the air, and getting them, maybe putting a little bit more weight on the buggy and really getting them to pull into that carriage so that they put their heads down and they exercise that top line. So hill work, anything that's long and low. Would you use the paste if a horse was tying up? Which paste? The electroaid paste or that race booster paste? I wouldn't use the race booster paste, but the electroaid paste, if a horse is tying up, can be beneficial, as well as the vitamin E selenium. Really, you can make any of the powders a paste. Get a big syringe and some applesauce and stick it in their mouth. But I don't know whether that was your question or not. Any other questions? Okay, I am going to turn off the recording. Thank you everybody for participating in tonight's webinar.